The M4. Sherman tank equipped with flame-throwing apparatus represented one of the Pacific War's most psychologically devastating weapons, a combination that leveraged American industrial capacity and tactical innovation to create a solution to defensive positions that conventional weapons struggled to overcome. The Japanese defensive strategy in the Pacific, particularly during the island campaigns of 1944 to 1945, relied heavily on fortified positions, bunkers, caves, and tunnel systems that were designed to withstand naval bombardment and artillery fire, that provided interlocking fields of fire against advancing infantry, and that allowed relatively small numbers of defenders to inflict disproportionate casualties on attacking forces. These positions were nearly impervious to conventional tank weapons. Armor-piercing shells passed through without causing significant damage to defenders sheltering behind thick concrete and earth. High-explosive rounds created blast effects that dissipated quickly in confined spaces, and machine gun fire couldn't penetrate the firing slits and reinforced openings through which Japanese defenders engaged American troops. The flame tank, officially designated the M4A3R3, but commonly called the Zippo by American troops who served alongside them, was specifically developed to address this tactical problem. The system replaced the tank's bow-mounted machine gun with a flame-throwing apparatus that could project burning fuel up to 150 yards, creating a jet of fire that could be directed into cave mouths, bunker openings, and fortified positions with devastating effect. The fuel mixture, a combination of gasoline thickened with additives to make it adhere to surfaces and burn longer, created fires that consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces, generated temperatures that made positions uninhabitable, and created psychological terror that conventional weapons couldn't match. The flame tank combined this offensive capability with the Sherman's armor protection and mobility, allowing it to advance under fire and bring its weapon to bear at close range where its effects were most devastating. The tactical employment of flame tanks in the Pacific evolved through experience gained on islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, where American forces refined techniques for using these weapons most effectively against Japanese defensive positions. The standard approach involved combined arms teams, where flame tanks worked closely with infantry, with conventional tanks providing covering fire, and with engineers identifying targets and directing flame tank operations. The flame tanks would advance to positions where they could engage cave entrances or bunker openings, protected by covering fire from supporting units, and would direct sustained bursts of flame into the target until it was neutralized. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. Soldiers who had withstood naval bombardment and artillery fire, who had maintained defensive positions despite heavy casualties from small arms and explosives, often abandoned positions or committed suicide rather than face the approaching flame tanks. What made Japanese defenders particularly vulnerable to flame tanks wasn't simply the weapon's physical effects, but rather the way it exploited specific aspects of Japanese defensive doctrine and psychology that had been shaped by years of fighting in China and by the military culture that had developed within the Imperial Japanese Army. Japanese defensive positions were designed for prolonged resistance, with extensive underground complexes that provided shelter and protected movement between fighting positions. These tunnel systems created environments where flame weapons were especially effective. The burning fuel would flow into tunnels following gravity and air currents. The fires would consume oxygen throughout connected spaces, creating suffocation effects far beyond the immediate point of impact. And the psychological terror of fire in confined underground spaces was overwhelming, even for highly motivated defenders who had been trained to fight to the death. The Japanese military had developed tactics and weapons to counter most American combat systems they faced in the Pacific. They created anti-tank tactics using magnetic mines, satchel charges, and suicide attacks against American armor. They developed infiltration techniques that exploited gaps in American defensive positions. They learned to dig positions deep enough to survive naval bombardment and to construct defenses that could withstand the preliminary fires that American forces delivered before assault operations. But the flame tank presented a tactical problem that Japanese doctrine and weapons couldn't effectively answer. The range of the flame projector meant that Japanese anti-tank teams had to engage flame tanks at distances where American supporting fire was overwhelming. The mobility and armor of the Sherman meant that obstacles and anti-tank weapons that might slow or stop conventional tanks didn't prevent flame tanks from reaching positions where they could engage defensive positions. Most critically, the nature of flame weapons meant that the elaborate underground defensive positions that Japanese forces had constructed became death traps rather than protection when flame tanks could direct sustained fire into their entrances. The specific effects of flame weapons on Japanese defensive positions were documented in after-action reports and in accounts from American troops who witnessed these engagements. A burst of flame directed into a cave entrance would create immediate casualties among defenders positioned near the opening. The burning fuel would flow deeper into the cave system following tunnels and connected chambers. Oxygen would be consumed, creating suffocation effects that killed defenders who weren't directly touched by flame. And the psychological impact would cause surviving defenders to either attempt escape, where they would be killed by American infantry and supporting weapons, or to commit suicide rather than burning to death. The choice facing Japanese defenders in positions targeted by flame tanks was effectively between burning, suffocating, exposing themselves to American fire by escaping, or suicide. None of these options offered survival, which meant that flame tanks could neutralize defensive positions that conventional weapons might require days of combat and heavy casualties to reduce. The psychological dimension of flame weapons extended beyond their immediate tactical effects. Japanese soldiers who witnessed flame tank attacks on nearby positions understood what awaited them if American forces employed these weapons against their own positions. The knowledge that elaborate defenses offered no protection against flame weapons, that fighting to the death, which Japanese military culture demanded, would mean dying by fire or suffocation rather than in honorable combat, created a kind of existential dread that affected morale and defensive effectiveness even before flame tanks were actually employed against specific positions. Some Japanese commanders, recognizing that their underground defensive systems had become vulnerabilities rather than strengths when facing flame weapons, modified their defensive approaches by creating shallower positions with multiple exits that might allow evacuation when flame attacks occurred. But these modifications reduced the defensive advantage that the original positions provided, creating a tactical dilemma where Japanese forces had to choose between protection against conventional weapons and vulnerability to flame weapons. The American development and employment of flame tanks represented systematic effort to solve specific tactical problems through application of technology and resources that Japanese forces couldn't match. The United States had industrial capacity to produce specialized vehicles in quantities sufficient to equip multiple battalions, had logistical systems to deliver the fuel and maintenance support these vehicles required, and had tactical doctrine that could integrate flame tanks into combined arms operations that maximize their effectiveness. The Japanese, operating with increasingly strained logistics and with industrial capacity focused on producing conventional weapons and maintaining basic force sustainment, couldn't develop equivalent systems even if their tactical situation had suggested flame weapons would be valuable additions to their arsenal. The asymmetry wasn't just in the weapons themselves, but in the entire system of development, production, logistics, and tactical employment that flame tanks represented. The specific battles where flame tanks proved decisive illustrated how completely they had changed the tactical calculus of Pacific Island combat. On Iwo Jima, where Japanese defenders had created perhaps the most elaborate underground defensive system of the entire Pacific War, American flame tanks were instrumental in reducing positions that conventional weapons and tactics struggled to overcome. The caves and tunnels that honeycombed Mount Suribachi and the island's northern sectors provided protection against naval gunfire and artillery, but became death traps when flame tanks could direct sustained fire into their entrances. On Okinawa, where Japanese forces had 3 months to prepare defenses and where they created defensive systems based on lessons learned from earlier defeats. Flame tanks again proved critical to American success in reducing fortified positions, particularly in the fighting for the Shuri Line, where Japanese defenses were most sophisticated and where casualties would have been far higher without the ability to employ flame weapons against underground positions. The Japanese response to flame tanks, or more accurately, the absence of effective response, reflected broader problems that Imperial Japanese forces faced during the war's final year. Japanese tactical doctrine had been developed primarily through experience fighting Chinese forces who lacked the industrial capacity and technological sophistication of Western powers, and through early Pacific War battles where Japanese forces had generally held initiative and where American weapons and tactics were still evolving. By 1944 to 1945, Key American forces had developed integrated combined arms capabilities that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated and that Japanese resources couldn't counter. Flame tanks were part of this broader pattern. They represented American ability to identify tactical problems, develop technological solutions, produce them in quantity, and employ them in ways that Japanese forces couldn't effectively counter. The accounts from Japanese survivors of flame tank attacks, gathered during post-war interviews and from documents captured during the war, revealed the psychological impact these weapons created. Soldiers described the terror of hearing flame tanks approaching their positions, the desperate choices facing defenders in caves and bunkers when flame began pouring into their positions, and the overwhelming sense that there was no defense against weapons that made elaborate fortifications into death traps. Some described the decision to commit suicide rather than face burning as the only choice that preserved any element of control over their deaths, while others recounted the chaos as defenders attempted to escape from positions under flame attack only to be killed by American infantry and supporting weapons. The common theme was helplessness. The recognition that years of defensive preparation, all the tunneling and fortification that Japanese engineers had created, offered no protection against weapons that turned enclosed spaces into furnaces. While the broader significance of flame tanks in the Pacific War extended beyond their immediate tactical effects to influence how both American and Japanese forces understood the operational situation during the war's final months. For American commanders, flame tanks represented a capability that could reduce Japanese defensive positions with acceptable casualties, that could maintain offensive momentum that might otherwise bog down in prolonged siege operations, and that could complete campaigns in timeframes that supported broader strategic objectives. For Japanese commanders, flame tanks represented another example of American material superiority that Japanese forces couldn't match, that made defensive strategies that had worked earlier in the war increasingly futile. And that reinforced the reality that Japan faced defeat unless some fundamental change occurred in the strategic situation. The existence of weapons like flame tanks, combined with American air superiority, naval dominance, and overwhelming artillery and logistical advantages, made clear that Japanese forces were fighting a losing war regardless of individual soldiers' courage or defensive preparation's sophistication. The question of why Japanese soldiers had no answer for American flame tanks ultimately reflected the asymmetry that characterized the Pacific War during its final year. Japanese forces were defending positions with limited resources, constrained logistics, declining air and naval support, and tactical doctrine that hadn't adapted adequately to American capabilities. American forces were attacking with industrial capacity that could produce specialized weapon systems, with logistical superiority that could sustain complex operations, with air and naval dominance that enabled combined arms operations, and with tactical innovation that continuously developed new solutions to defensive problems. Flame tanks were part of this broader pattern. They weren't invincible superweapons. They had vulnerabilities and limitations that Japanese forces theoretically could have exploited. But exploiting those vulnerabilities would have required resources, tactical adaptation, and operational freedom that Japanese forces increasingly lacked as the war progressed toward its inevitable conclusion.